There is nothing so wonderful in the world as telling stories.
Tous les matins, on essaye de traverser le miroir et de regarder le monde différemment.
It is true, I am a woman. Une fois que ce saut est fait, tout devient possible.
Hello, I'm Charlotte Casiraghi. Welcome to the podcast of Les Rendezvous littéraires Rue Cambon, a place where we meet to talk about writing, to talk about books. Let's meet women writers who have just taken their first step, the most decisive, the most difficult in the world of literature. How did their vocation call to them? What are their writing rituals? Who reads them and what do they read?
I'm Erica Wagner, and it's my pleasure to introduce Aria Aber and welcome her to Chanel's podcast, Les Rencontres. We're here to talk about Aria's remarkable debut, Good Girl. Its heroine, Nila, is the strong-willed daughter of doctors from Afghanistan who fled their homeland before she was born. Nila grows up in a brutalist social housing block in Berlin. After the events of September 11th, 2001, being a Muslim in a city like Berlin, where the neo-Nazi movement is on the rise, where she is already perceived as an outsider despite it being the city of her birth, becomes even more challenging. The death of Nila's mother strips off another layer of skin. She tries to find herself in the nightclubs and bars of the city, experimenting with self, experimenting with love and belonging and fear. At 19 years old, she falls in love with an American writer, Marlowe, a man nearly twice her age. The book tracks Nila's yearning for his love, for his damage. I was ravaged by the hunger to ruin my life, Nila says. Writing in The Guardian, Dina Nayeri, author of The Ungrateful Refugee, called Good Girl a dark, breathtaking novel, a must-read about the complexities of Afghan sexuality, family, shame, poverty, and power. Nila shines in her wildness, in her yearning for beauty and freedom. She is broken and defiant and bold, outlining for herself a new kind of purity, goodness, and faith, her own anthems of youth. I found it a powerful and memorable coming-of-age novel, written in a poet's confident voice. It is forthcoming in translation in German, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Swedish, and Japanese. You'll tell me, Aria, if I've missed any languages out. Like her protagonist, Aria was born and raised in Germany. She now lives in the United States, dividing her time between Vermont and Brooklyn. She has a BA in English Literature from Goldsmiths College in London and an MFA in Poetry from NYU. Her debut poetry collection, Hard Damage, won the Prairie Schooner Book Prize and the Whiting Award. She is a former Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford and a graduate student at USC, and her writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The New Republic, the Yale Review, Granta, and elsewhere. Raised speaking Farsi and German, she writes in her third language, English. She serves as the poetry editor of Amulet, as a contributing editor at the Yale Review, and she works as an assistant professor of creative writing at the University of Vermont. Welcome, Aria. It's so wonderful to have the chance to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Erica. I feel very grateful.
Well, it's marvelous to have a chance to talk about such a remarkable novel and about the process of your work. And the first part of our discussion for Les Rencontres always focuses on your vocation as a writer and how you came to that vocation. So I would love you to tell us about your beginnings and whether it was always a calling for you. I've heard you say, which I think is very interesting, that writing is like faith in a way.
It's true. And I think that is how I relate to writing nowadays. I kind of always wanted to do something with language. It was what I was talented at. It was what I was interested in, what fascinated me. I always carried a book with me. There are many photos of me at 10 years old at a cousin's wedding with like just a book in the corner, you know? So reading was a way to escape the boredom of my daily life. And once I realized that I could also write, that just felt like, you know, like magic almost. There was a time in my life where I thought I wanted to become a lawyer because that seemed like the other sensible thing you do when you are obsessed with books and texts. You become the interpreter of the law. But I'm ultimately glad that I didn't, because I think my temperament is too unruly for something as precise as law. Yeah.
And I mentioned you grew up speaking two languages, Farsi and German, but you've chosen to write your novel and indeed your poetry in English. Can you tell us a bit about that decision, that choice?
Of course. It wasn't a super conscious decision. I think more or less it just happened in the trajectory of my life that I started writing in English. But the language was always very present in my life. My dad is an Anglophile, if I can call him that. He was subscribed to Time magazine. He watched the news in English, listened to the radio, like BBC and CNN, all of those things. So English was present in my household. And I also was sent to a bilingual school, similar to Nila in the novel, even though mine was not a boarding school at all. So I started learning English with like high immersion, starting at like age 10, I guess. And then I ended up studying English literature in London, as you know. And I think it was at that time when I realized that poetry is still alive and well in the Anglophone world that I really started seriously writing in English. Beforehand, I had mostly been writing in German. So it was in my early 20s. And I became quite ambitious and serious, but also it was fun to teach myself how to write in another language, to be estranged from the material on the page, to like encounter mistakes, grammatical mistakes, sometimes phonetic mistakes, and to, I don't know, explore something. Because especially in poetry, there is so much flexibility in terms of metaphor and sound. So my position as a foreigner or outsider within the language, I think actually equipped me.
It's a very interesting perspective. And I feel as a writer, in a way, I'm always trying to make myself strange to my own process. So it's another way to do that, to make the familiar unfamiliar and new.
Exactly, yeah.
You mentioned your debut poetry collection, Hard Damage, and that has, I would say, an almost documentary aspect to it, charting Afghanistan's place in world history through the characters that it depicts. What made you turn to the form of the novel to tell Nila's story?
I always wanted to write a novel, and I was always very much drawn to narrative, long-form fiction, even more than a short story. I think the short story might be even the hardest literary form to master. I don't know if I just say that because I've been writing poetry and now I wrote a novel, so the short story is this like last frontier in terms of creative writing for me. But having a somewhat traditional linear narrative form to tell a story that is mainly about exile or a child of refugees growing up in Germany felt like I was exercising a sense of control over the kinds of narratives and stories that I grew up around, because they're full of so many lacunae. They're full of holes and like gaps, and there's no sense of linearity. In some ways, I feel like living in exile creates a sense of atemporality. Everything feels like it's taken out of time, and the past always dictates the present, and even the future is often like thought of in the retrospective or in relation to the past. So just this entrapment by something that is no longer there creates a very surreal sense of existence. And I wanted to write something that is more or less linear in order to counteract that. And the novel form, especially the Bildungsroman, seemed like an interesting genre, or the right genre for me to explore. And it also felt a little bit like a social or political argument that I was making for myself by choosing a young, rebellious Afghan woman as the protagonist of something that is, in terms of genre, part of the Western tradition, you know?
And I wonder, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I'm so fascinated by what you say about those lacuna in the stories that you hear. Does writing a novel, as you say, a Bildungsroman that tells a story of a young woman's growing up, I think in maybe all the kinds of stories that we hear, so much is missing. As you say, we're out of control, and you gain a kind of control over perhaps the stories that are not told, that people don't want to tell, your family, those around you, and your community.
Yes, I like that. And you didn't put any words in my mouth. I absolutely feel as though I am telling stories in this novel in particular that are a little bit shameful, maybe, or not necessarily addressed in a lot of traditional or conservative Afghan households. It's not necessarily true for the entirety of my family. I'm very lucky that way. But I know that it's, even in a Western family, it might be somewhat scandalous or scandalizing for a daughter to write so openly about sex and drugs. Those are transgressive topics, especially for a 19-year-old. And I was very aware that I was doing that. However, I felt the calling to explore that aspect of girlhood too, which I don't see reflected often enough in literature or in other types of media either, without there being a really tragic ending for the heroine. And I didn't want to continue that.
So, Aria, I'm going to read a little quote from this wonderful novel that I really loved. It's Nila talking about how she's drawn to her art form as a photographer. Life flushes through me, and in return my soul is anguished to translate that movement, to make part of it real. My entire life I danced on the outside, looking in. I saw a cliff, and I became the cliff. A part of me was gone, and art, I thought, once I'd figured out how to find the right image, the right composition, once I'd turned the loss into an object, would bring a piece of me back.
I love that. I love that you chose that part.
Is that perhaps how you feel, this sense of claiming? Nila has this sense of claiming from her creativity.
Yeah, I definitely relate to that, even though, of course, my medium is different and my toolbox is different because I'm not working with photography, but with language. And there is still a similarity in the sense that you compose something even when you take a picture, despite the fact that photography operates under this assumption of pseudo-objectivity, like the photographer is still an artist and is still choosing what to frame and not to frame. So there is a sense of control. And in writing, I feel like rather than framing or staging something on the surface, what we do is that we dig at something with language. We dig and we dig until we get to the truth, or what we think the truth is. And that does feel like a psychological, metaphysical, and like psychic reclaiming, definitely. And that is, I think that part that you read kind of is the thesis statement for my vocation. Yeah.
The world of poetry and the world of the novel can be very different. I'm thinking in terms of publishing and the literary world. Can you tell us how you found your agent, Bill Clegg, and how you came to be published as a novelist?
Yes, of course. I love Bill Clegg, greatest agent. Very grateful for him and Marion and everyone, Anna, like the whole team is just incredible. I just want to give them a shout out. It is true that the world of poetry publishing is minuscule in comparison with the world of fiction and especially with novels. And I'm still understanding that. I'm still in the middle of it since the novel has been out for a month, and the opportunities and doors that are opening are quite fascinating and just larger in scope. But also in terms of material aspects like money and book printing and the resources that you get from your publisher, it's just very vastly different. And I found Bill Clegg, well, I knew about him because he represents a lot of my favorite authors, and I had one acquaintance who was working with him. And I just emailed him out of the blue through the website. So I got him through the slush pile, basically. But he read the draft of my novel pretty fast and called me, and we had a long conversation. And I just felt as though he understood something about the soul of the book. And I really needed his insight and his vision, because once we finished that conversation and I got his like editorial letters and stuff like that, it all just fell into place. You know, he was kind of the missing piece. But generally, I am very guarded with my drafts, so I don't show them to anyone. And for the novel, he was my first reader. But I know for the poets that might be listening that there are people who represent poets now too.
At this point, I'd like to invite you to read the very opening of Good Girl.
Of course. So this is the first page of Good Girl. 1. The train back to Berlin took 7 hours, and the towel in my suitcase was still wet from my last swim in the lake, dampening the pages of my favorite books. I took the S-Bahn and then the U-Bahn home to Lipschitzallee and walked past the discount supermarket, the old pharmacy, and the Corboni bakery with the orange shop cat lounging outside its door. In our building's elevator, an intimate odor assaulted my nostrils. Urine mixed with ash. "Hello, spider," I said, looking at the cobweb in the corner. The ceiling lamp twitched, turning alien the swastika graffiti. My key, fastened by a pink ribbon, turned in the old lock. Nobody was home. I kicked off my shoes. The cat meowed for food, its dander floating in the air. My room was merely all it had been for so many years. A suffocating box with a tiny window, pink sheets, and that Goethe quote I'd painted in golden letters above my desk. The popcorn ceiling seemed lower than before. I wiped the kitchen counters, walked into my parents' bedroom, opened their closet, and pulled out my mother's cashmere frock. Maybe I cried. Maybe I didn't. What I did was lie in bed and sleep until dark, covering my face with her dress.
Thank you so much. In this part of the podcast, I'm going to ask you about your process of writing. So the first thing I want to know is how you create your day at your desk and how you balance the obligations of life, your work, with your writing.
I usually teach during the semester, so a couple of days a week I will be on the college campus of the University of Vermont. And usually throughout the week, my life revolves around teaching. I have very little time to make space for my own writing, my own creative writing, because I will be focusing on my students' work and on the lesson plans, which I'm usually behind on, at all times, and the grading. As you know, there are a lot of aspects to teaching that are extremely exciting, like having all of this free time and being on the academic calendar, which gives you a lot of liberties, but then having to structure your own workload during the week can be hard. So I usually like to make time for myself one day a week, maybe during the weekend. And depending on whether or not I feel the call to write that day, like my Sunday afternoon, for example, or my Saturday afternoon, might just be a reading day where I read for pleasure, because reading is a part of my process and my practice. If I don't read, I don't feel connected to the material, I think. And most of the time when I feel like I'm blocked or the creative juices are just not flowing, what gets me out of it is reading something really old, like nothing contemporary, something like, just a short story by Tolstoy. That might even be boring and not as exciting as Anna Karenina, but just something to remind me that people have been doing this for hundreds of years, and that the construction of a story can also be flawed and messy and doesn't have to be this perfectly polished thing that I think now that I've become professionalized as a writer, I see oftentimes in contemporary literature. So to just give myself a sense of permission, I think, to make mistakes and to play, I like to return to older writing. And yeah, I usually work best at night. I'm very nocturnal. This is a leftover habit from childhood where I would steal secret time to read books or write in my diary in my bed after my parents had gone to bed. And I kind of still have kept it up. I feel very connected to the spirit of writing when it's nighttime.
Well, no one will bother you.
Exactly.
In the dark of the
Yes.
night.
Yes.
It really is your own time. Well, talking about reading and loving to read leads me to ask who the formative writers have been for you. I'd be very interested to hear you talk about Paul Celan, the Romanian-born Jewish writer who I know is so important in German literature, and also Rilke, whose work I know you explore in your poetry collection. And there's an important scene in this novel that takes place at the Duino Castle in Trieste, where Rilke, of course, began his great elegies. Your epigraph is from Kafka. So who are the writers that you turn to over and again?
I love this question. And I love the three writers you listed as the exemplary ones for the possibility of my formative influences, because I think my impulse would have been to list the three authors that are mainly, or like, I guess one of them is French, but are not German writers. So like Margaret Duras, The Lover, was a book that really changed my life. And then Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. And also Voyage in the Dark and Good Morning at Midnight by Jean Rhys. I love Jean Rhys. She kind of like really broke open something in me that had hardened and become cynical for a while. I just really relate to her writing, and I think she's criminally underread, even though I feel like she has a niche renaissance right now. But the German writers, I have to say, I have a very complex relationship with them. With Rilke, it's almost like a love-hate relationship. Like there is something very sacred and serious about his approach to writing. And I feel it in his poetry. I feel connected to the divine when I read his poetry. At the same time, I think I don't know if I agree with everything he did in his life. That's a conversation for another time. But that was something that I was trying to investigate in Heart Damage. Whereas with Paul Celan and with Kafka, I feel a kinship with them because they were foreigners in the German language themselves, and they were writing in German from the outside. And Celan, more so than Kafka, really defamiliarized and estranged and almost mutilated the German language into something beautiful and hermetic and opaque, and it feels very thingy when I read his poems. They're obviously so self-referential. He has this imagery bank with things that he uses, and all of that became very impactful for me when I was writing my own book. I was returning to his poems over and over again just because they contain such mystery, but at the same time exist within a very acute historical context and are politicized because of who the writer was and what he was attempting to do with language. And I think that was important to me because I wanted to write beautifully with like an aesthetically pleasing sound or musicality, a lushness, but still remain political in my poetry. And then Kafka, I think, became important in the context of Good Girl because I wrote that scene or like that chapter where Nila ends up it was kind of more or less subconscious, where Nila ends up in a Kafka class with Doreen and has that sentence where she says, it's like kind of a rhetorical question, and she says, who but an Afghan girl could understand a bug just trying to survive, like waking up as a bug just trying to survive or something. And her feelings of self-hatred and insecurity, but also like the suffocation of the familial tradition, felt very related to Kafka, because I think Walter Benjamin says somewhere that Kafka is both a mystic writer because he's concerned with the traditions that have been inherited, but he's also a writer of urban dwelling, because he wrote at the beginning of the century when cities were exploding or had been exploding for a while. And even though Nila lives 100 years after Kafka, I think they share the condition of being between tradition and modernity, or regression and progression, you know.
What a wonderful answer. Thank you. And I think it hooks into my next question. You create such a remarkable balance in this novel between shame and desire. Perhaps this is impossible to answer, but how do you conjure that in your work? How aware are you of creating a balance when you're writing about these challenging topics?
That is such an interesting question, and I don't think anyone has asked me that before, whether or not, or how I'm aware, or whether I'm aware of creating balance between these topics. I think, to be honest, a lot of writing is subconscious, and I follow the language where it takes me, and I follow my obsessions where they take me. But I become more conscious of these things during revision. And I knew that this book on Nila as a protagonist is very self-indulgent with her shame. You know, she wallows in the pity and the self-hatred, but she also is obsessed with desire, or is driven by desire. She's not obsessed with it. She's driven by it. And she's just so impulsive. And I think what I was conscious of even before I started writing the novel was that I wanted to create a protagonist who's very active and who yearns and wants, and very openly. Because one thing that I started seeing, and also a lot of my favorite novels are like that, is that they center a female protagonist who's kind of repressed. And I mean, Nila's repressed in other ways, but repressed and quiet and passive. And I wanted to write a young woman who's very active. And I think I'm always interested in dialectical tensions between things that seem like they're opposites on the surface, like shame and desire, even though both of those things always coexist, right? Not shame doesn't always coexist with desire, but you could make the argument that why do you feel shame? Because you desired being accepted by something, or you desired being right in a certain moment. This is the universal feeling of inadequacy or having made a mistake. And the same is true with desire. If you desire something, you want something, you put yourself out there, you're vulnerable, that might incite a feeling of shame. They're very related. So I wanted Nila to embody a couple of opposites, but I don't think I was aware of whether or not I achieved the balance. So thank you for saying I did.
There's lots of different kinds of metamorphoses in this book. How do you approach writing about those altered states of consciousness?
It's an incredibly difficult enterprise, mainly because I think a lot of people who don't have experience with mind-altering substances find it incredibly boring to read about that in fiction or in literature in general. I am very interested in people writing through altered states of consciousness, or trying to describe something that feels so beyond language most of the time, especially with psychedelic drugs. And often I have to concur, is quite boring to the outside world. It's almost like describing dreams, right? You're describing something about your subconscious changing, which affects your consciousness. I really try to focus on both the tactile and physical effects of it, which is why there is so much smell and sweat and sensory data in the novel, while also trying to investigate parts of how it affects the mind. So, yeah. I didn't do any method acting exercises for this novel. I didn't go out and do drugs. I had a very wild party phase in my early 20s, and I was drawing on memories and also listening to a lot of music that reminded me of that time, which helped me get back into that setting, I think.
In the last part of our podcast, we talk about the reception of your novel and how Good Girl has been received into the world. I quoted that wonderful review from The Guardian, and there was a marvelous piece in the New York Times saying that with this book, you have made the world more spacious. What does that mean to you as a writer?
You know, hearing that right now just moves me to tears. I just feel incredibly touched and happy and grateful. And I also know that I can't take it for granted at all, because this is not something that anyone can control, how a book is being received, by whom the book is being received, who will read it, who will review it. I feel very lucky, and I just feel like an infinite sense of gratitude for everyone who's taking time out of their day and life to read the book and to platform it. And my biggest hope is that maybe they can connect with it in some way, or at least enjoy reading it. Because even though I have a lot of political convictions, I'm not trying to be didactic in my work primarily, even though it can sometimes be read as didactic. What is most important to me in my writing, and especially when I read fiction too, is that people can just connect with the life that is being represented on the page. And having people resonate with it is just more than I could ask for, or it is everything that I could ask for. I'm just incredibly grateful.
After you finished the book, were there any responses, perhaps from people you knew or family members, that were especially significant to you?
I have a friend named Perwana Nazif. She's a writer and a critic and a curator, and she's also Afghan. She's my age, and I think she read it in like one sitting and told me that she needed to read this book and that it saw her entirely. And she was a very early reader. She got a galley. That felt very, very meaningful to me. I wrote a book that I think a version of myself as a younger person would have needed to see, so that she understands that she's not alone, you know, that it's okay to be a wayward Afghan woman and follow your desires. And it felt very moving to me that someone who shares my ethnic and social background did feel seen by it, because I think the biggest fear when you write something that is so particular and specific to a certain type of minority, as I did, is that people feel offended by it because it doesn't reflect and include them. And the tragedy of being a minority writer is that people often want to extrapolate a statement about the general group, you know. So even though this is just a very specific, individual, particular story and doesn't speak to every element and the entire group of Afghans in the diaspora, it just felt good to have one person respond to it in this way, where she felt held by the book.
Well, maybe that nearly answers what was going to be my next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because you are representing exile and diaspora in this book through Nila's experience and that of her family. What does it mean for you to show the reality of these lives and the variety of these lives, their individuality? You talked about one reader, but your book goes out into the world.
The great thing about writing a novel is that you can create a world in which many different characters coexist. And even within the limited world of that refugee community in Berlin-Gropiusstadt, in that one building or that neighborhood that I chose to write about in the years of 2010 to 2012, I created a set and a cast that I felt an ethical responsibility towards, to represent them accurately with their mistakes, with their hopes, their dreams, with their faults and their strengths. And even though that world is made up, as I didn't grow up there and didn't live there, I feel so much tenderness towards those characters. And I made it my mission to reflect real life, to not romanticize it, to not critique them or blame anyone in the novel. It was just important to me to show humans, to show characters as humans that are as complex and imperfect as people are in real life.
Finally, at the end of our podcast, we have a few questions that we put to all of our guests. So here they come. The first one is, what is the most surprising thing you've learned from being a writer?
One thing that has been incredibly surprising about being a writer is that people actually do read your work. I think I approach the page very privately. I'm very guarded with my drafts. I don't share them with anyone, and hence I don't really have an audience in mind when I write. But it has been incredibly compelling and also nourishing to understand that writing is not as solitary of an act as it feels like when you sit down to write. And another thing that has been surprising about fulfilling my dreams of being a writer and having published these books is that it doesn't change anything pragmatic about my personality. I thought that by the age of 34 that I am now, I would have figured out a way to answer my emails in a timely manner and sort out my life and be less chaotic. But I am still the same chaotic person I was when I was 12 years old and hadn't yet completed a book. So it doesn't change a lot about the pragmatic aspects of my personality, even though, of course, materially, my life feels very different. But in some ways, it means that the sanctity of writing something new will always feel the same way, as refreshing, as surprising, as mysterious as the first time.
Sticking with the theme of surprise, what would people be surprised to learn about you?
Well, I think that people would be quite surprised to find out that I'm actually an introvert and by now live a very, very boring day-to-day life.
What is your idea of perfect happiness? Maybe these two things are allied.
Those things are a little connected. I think there are two ways to answer this question. One would be to have a lot of peace and quiet time, which means to have material stability and the privilege of renting a nice apartment and to have a happy and healthy family. And that leads me to the second part of my answer, which is that happiness for me is never just individual or singular. It's always tied to the collective. I can't feel happy entirely if the people I love are suffering. So perfect happiness would probably necessitate a restructuring of our whole world. It would mean that the Middle East is finally at peace. And yeah, I think at the same time, there is a Buddhist way to answer this too, which is that you can find happiness in the smallest of gestures, in the smallest of interactions with strangers. And it is a fleeting feeling, which means that it won't last, but also that we can access it all the time if we look for it. So yeah, I think those are three ways of answering this question.
What advice would you give to anyone who wants to express their creativity?
To not be afraid. Fear is the killer of creativity. We shouldn't be afraid to make mistakes or be bad at first and to try to get the first word on the page. People really don't know how many bad drafts artists, writers, photographers may create before the thing that we end up seeing on the other side is finally finished. And I would also tell young people to immerse themselves in what is already out there, to read as many books, watch as many films, go to as many museum shows as possible to converse with the art that already exists in the world. I think it will give them clues and permission to create what they want to create and provide them with a sense of inspiration without being derivative.
How would you like to be remembered as a writer?
That is a hard one. How would I like to be remembered as a writer? As a good one.
Good answer. And finally, can you tell us something about a second novel? What would your second novel look like?
My next book will be set in the 80s in Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation. And that's all I can say for now. Very
enticing. We can leave it at that. Thank you so much, Aria Aber, for joining us on our podcast, Les Rencontres. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, and I hope we have a chance to talk again soon. I can't wait to read that next book when it comes. Thank you so much for having me. It has been an absolute pleasure, and I hope we get to meet each other soon. It would be such a joy.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Rendezvous littéraire Rue Cambon podcast. To discover more about it, you will find images, links, and references on the Chanel website. À bientôt!